Even when life loses its meaning, there is still life. But what about when it no longer feels like living? Just a monotonous flow of tasks, distractions, and demands. When you wake up, get dressed, gulp down your coffee, and head out the door. Not because you want to, but simply because you have to. You squeeze into crowded public transport, face a day surrounded by people who don't really hear you. Say, "Good morning," with a tired smile, while everything inside feels absent. That's where the silent hollowing begins, the kind that has no name, no diagnosis, but slowly eats away at you. Nietzsche foresaw it when he spoke of the last man, someone who gave up on higher ideals and lives only to avoid suffering. He doesn't want risk or depth. He wants comfort. And when comfort becomes the goal of life, something in the soul begins to fall asleep. We live in a time where suffering isn't faced, it's numbed. Social media replaces meaningful connections. Entertainment takes the place of silence. Performance replaces feeling. In this landscape, what looks like freedom is actually a prison made of consensus, where everyone thinks the same, acts the same, reacts the same. Jung would call this the uniformity of the psyche, the danger of being too well adapted to external molds, forgetting who you are entirely. And when the self dissolves to fit into others' expectations, the process of individuation, the path of becoming who you truly are, is abandoned. You start existing for others, but stop living for yourself. And slowly, you lose the connection to what makes you unique. But what if that emptiness is the first sign that there's still life inside you, begging to wake up? There are people who wake up every day with an anguish they can't name. It's not sadness, not physical pain. It's the sense of being lost in a world that moves too fast, but has no direction. For centuries, religions offered symbolic structures to organize life's chaos. There were rituals, purposes, archetypes, paths. But as those structures crumbled, many found themselves free, but also ungrounded. And what looked like liberation revealed a different kind of prison. A life without meaning. Jung recognized early on the psychic cost of that loss. To him, myths, symbols, and archetypes weren't just cultural inventions, they were deep expressions of the human soul. When there is no longer an inner symbol to sustain existence, the mind quietly begins to suffer. Life turns into a mechanical sequence of actions, devoid of soul. And the worst kind of loneliness isn't being alone. It's being disconnected from your own reason for existing. This emptiness doesn't scream. It whispers. It shows up when everything seems fine, yet something's missing. It appears when you finally achieve what you were aiming for, and still feel a void. It's not failure. It's the absence of meaning. And in that absence, many start desperately looking for something to fill the gap. Work, addictions, empty relationships, or any kind of distraction. But the hole remains, because it doesn't want to be filled. It wants to be understood. Emptiness, when not avoided, transforms. And maybe it's there to remind you of something essential. That what you lost back then wasn't just faith. It was contact with what keeps you alive inside. An understanding that emptiness demands something reason often can't reach. There are moments when no logic can save you, no argument is enough, and all that's left is an intimate, almost irrational impulse to keep going. It's the realization that surviving isn't just an intellectual decision. It's a leap into the dark. Not because there are guarantees, but because stopping would mean losing even the hope of finding something. At certain points in life, you have to trust something you can't yet see, even if it's only the intuition that there's more inside you than what pain allows you to perceive. And that step, which might look like madness from the outside, is often the beginning of real healing. Because it's not about solving a problem, it's about answering an internal call. This surrender to the unknown, defying control and fear, is the first act of courage. And it's not so different from the surrender required to dive into the unconscious, where the parts of you you've ignored or rejected still live. And when those parts begin to surface, even if they bring pain or confusion, they also bring truth. And where there is truth, there is the possibility of rebuilding. Walking this path isn't comfortable, but it is authentic. And maybe that very authenticity is what opens the door to a life with real meaning, not imposed, but discovered. Because only those who dare to keep walking without guarantees are capable of finding what truly matters. And by doing so, You awaken a new kind of awareness, something greater than mere adaptation to what already exists. You awaken the desire to create new paths, new values, even if it means leaving behind everything that once seemed right. The problem is, the world doesn't welcome those who defy what's expected. It prefers the obedient, the unthinking. It prefers the comfort of repetition over the presence of someone who has chosen to live with intensity. It takes immense strength to refuse to become the last man, the one who clings to the safety of emotional and spiritual mediocrity, because there is pain in freedom, pain in becoming someone who no longer fits into the old world's molds. But that pain is also a gateway, because within it pulses the beginning of a new existence, one with backbone, depth, and presence. But this newness doesn't come from formulas or advice. It rises from within, when you dare to let go of what was handed to you and aren't afraid to rebuild from nothing. That's the kind of courage that transforms. The courage to stop repeating borrowed ideas and start creating. The courage to let the old self die so something fuller can be born. Not as an unreachable ideal, but as someone who breathes with their own lungs, thinks with their own mind, feels with their own heart. That transformation is the birth of an inner strength that doesn't depend on anyone's approval. And maybe, in that moment, what some call the soul is born. That part of you that exists when no one's watching, when everything's been taken, and you still remain. It's not about becoming perfect, but about becoming true. And that's when something begins to rise again. A sense of meaning that doesn't come from the outside, but grows slowly, from within. With each honest decision, each small choice that dares to break the autopilot. And it's precisely in that refusal that freedom begins to reveal its rawest form. Not as a romantic ideal, but as a heavy responsibility, the task of inventing your own life. Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the philosophers who explored this idea most deeply, said we aren't born with a fixed purpose. We are the ones who must create our own meaning. And that, contrary to what it may seem at first, can be more frightening than liberating. Because if no one is going to tell you who you are, then everything falls on your choices. There are no guarantees, no ready-made paths, just you, and the freedom to decide, and along with it, the weight of owning the consequences. Sartre believed this was the great anxiety of existence, total freedom, without divine molds, without a pre-written destiny, but he also saw in it the beauty of life, the chance to build something unique out of the void. Jung, on the other hand, recognized that same freedom as fertile ground, but he issued a warning. Without self-knowledge, there's a risk of acting based on unconscious patterns and repeating someone else's story, all while believing you're creating your own. For him, true freedom demands an inward gaze, a confrontation with the shadow, an understanding of what truly lives inside you. Because only then do your choices stop being automatic reactions and become conscious responses. Freedom, then, isn't doing whatever you want. It's knowing who's doing the wanting. It's having clarity about the impulses behind your steps. And that clarity, even when painful, is the first sign that real life is happening there. Life you didn't inherit, didn't copy, but are learning to sustain with strength, even when everything around you seems to ask you to give up. And still, even when we choose consciously, not everything makes sense right away. There are moments when suffering arrives unannounced, and it feels impossible to find any reason to keep going. That's where philosophy meets the heart of the human experience. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, wrote that human beings cannot live without meaning. But that meaning doesn't have to be invented. It can be discovered. Frankl saw firsthand what happens when everything is stripped from a person, except their inner freedom. And he realized that even in the worst circumstances, one choice remained: how to respond to what life imposes. To him, suffering isn't something that must always be avoided. It can, in certain moments, reveal a deeper meaning. And that revelation often only comes when everything else has failed. Jung also recognized this. For him, life's most intense conflicts weren't mere obstacles, they were invitations. Inner conflicts, losses, pain, and crises are signs that something within us is trying to surface, asking to be acknowledged. The unconscious speaks through symptoms, through emptiness, through anxiety, and listening to that language requires silence, courage, and openness. Not to explain the suffering, but to learn from it. Frankl didn't romanticize pain, but he saw in it a possibility. And so did Jung. Both understood that suffering can be a portal, a space where the ego bends, where the masks fall, and where finally the soul has a chance to show itself. Not as a promise of easy redemption, but as a truth that transforms. Sometimes, meaning isn't found in what we expected, but in how we move through the unexpected. For Frankl, this passage could happen in three main ways: through creation, through experience, and through attitude. Each one reveals a dimension of being that endures, even in the face of adversity. To create something, a work of art, a gesture, a project, is to give form to what pulses inside. It's turning pain into expression, emptiness into art, silence into language. Jung saw this creative impulse as essential to the process of individuation. The soul doesn't grow through thought alone, but through symbolic action, through the movement of what is born in the unconscious and made tangible. To create is to give voice to the invisible. The second way to find meaning, according to Frankl, is through experience. And not just any experience, but those that place us before beauty, love, nature, the presence of another. Moments where we feel touched by something greater, even if we don't understand it rationally. Jung knew these experiences opened psychic gateways. When we are truly moved by life, something inside us realigns. The soul recognizes, even if the ego does not. And finally, there's attitude. What we choose to hold on to, even when everything else is taken. Frankl saw meaning in how a person faces unavoidable suffering. Jung also recognized that strength. He knew that how we deal with our own demons matters more than defeating them. Our attitude toward the shadow determines whether it destroys us or transforms us. To create, to experience, to endure, with dignity. Three paths, one destination, to rediscover yourself, even when all seems lost. And maybe that's the beginning of an inner revolution, the kind no one sees, but that changes everything. Because there comes a moment when, even after creating, experiencing, and enduring, the question returns with force. What if none of this makes sense? That's when we face the most brutal tension of existence, the clash between the human desire for meaning and the universe's apparent indifference. Albert Camus called this the absurd, the collision between our search for answers and the silence of the world. For Camus, the tragedy wasn't the absence of meaning itself, but the fact that humans cannot stop searching for it. It's like shouting into a desert and hearing only the echo of your own voice. But what do you do when there's no answer? Do you give up? Pretend? Invent a comfortable lie? Camus proposed another way: rebellion. Not a violent rebellion, but an inner stance of resistance, living with clarity, even without promises. Jung, from a different perspective, recognized the same conflict. He saw this sense of absurdity as a reflection of an internal split, a rupture between the conscious ego and the deep contents of the unconscious. When the external world no longer offers certainty, the only real possibility for meaning becomes the listening to one's inner world. And that kind of listening is anything but easy, because it demands confronting the void head-on, without illusions, without escape. But it's in that confrontation that something new can be born. Camus' rebellion is not the end. It's the beginning of an awakening, a call to live intensely, even without a manual. For Jung, the unconscious functions in a similar way. It doesn't hand you ready-made answers, but symbols, images, intuitions, clues that you must decipher on your own. And it's in that process of listening that true consciousness begins to mature. Still, there are traps along the way. One of the most dangerous is the belief that meaning can be bought, taught, or memorized. Camus rejected any kind of faith used as an escape, what he called an irrational leap. A leap that doesn't seek truth but simply avoids the pain of facing reality. How many times do we cling to a belief, an ideology, a ready-made ideal, simply because it offers comfort? Not out of conviction, but out of fear. And it's that fear that makes us vulnerable to artificial answers, those that promise everything but cost us dearly, the loss of authenticity. Camus saw this as a betrayal of consciousness itself. Pretending you've found meaning when you've only buried your discomfort is the greatest of all deceptions. Jung saw that danger too. To him, blind faith that ignores inner experience doesn't heal. It only hides. When a person refuses to confront their own symbols, their own dreams, their own pain, They become a prisoner of external structures. True spirituality, according to Jung, requires depth. It requires a living relationship with mystery, not passive adherence to inherited answers. Seeking meaning is valid, but accepting just any meaning in order to escape the void is dangerous. Because in doing so, you disconnect from the only thing that could truly guide you, your own experience. And the emptiness you thought you'd conquered comes back even stronger, now disguised as a beautiful solution with no real roots. That's why, for Camus, the most honest response isn't to hide behind beliefs that promise meaning, but to accept the absurd and still choose to live fully, in spite of everything, to love, to create, to think, to feel, even without guarantees. That is the deepest form of rebellion, not giving up, even when the universe remains silent. This stance requires a rare kind of strength, the strength of someone who no longer seeks consolation, but presence. Someone who doesn't demand immediate answers but surrenders to the complexity of existence. For Jung, that's the beginning of wisdom. When the ego stops trying to control everything and starts to dialogue with the unconscious, a new way of living begins. A life that embraces paradoxes, contradictions, opposites, and still moves forward with awareness. Acceptance is not resignation. It's giving up the fight against what cannot be changed and beginning to transform what can be understood. And to understand, in this context, is to integrate. To integrate fear, anger, pain, impulses, memories, all the parts that for so long were hidden or repressed. This kind of deep acceptance is not passivity. It is courage. It is the foundation for a rebellion that doesn't destroy, but builds. A silent, inner rebellion that says, even without guarantees, I choose to be here fully. What Camus called rebellion and Jung called integration are two names for the same act. The decision to live with depth and truth, even when everything feels uncertain. Even when everything feels uncertain. Even when the weight of the world seems unbearable. Still, there are those who keep going. Not because they expect a reward, but because they've learned to love the effort itself. Camus used the myth of Sisyphus to speak about this. The man condemned to push a boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down every day. At first glance, it seems like the perfect metaphor for despair. But Camus offered another reading, and said that even in the face of this absurd repetition, we can imagine Sisyphus happy. Happy not because he defeated fate, but because he chose to face it. Because in accepting the tragic nature of existence, he becomes free. And that freedom comes from the act of continuing, despite everything. Jung, in a very similar way, saw in life's repetitions a chance to awaken. When unconscious patterns repeat, difficult relationships, recurring emotions, old frustrations, or even the simple act of getting up each day to go to a job that no longer makes sense. These are not just accidents or destiny. They are the psyche trying to speak, trying to be heard. As long as those repetitions are ignored, the boulder will keep rolling back down. But the moment you understand the pattern, something shifts. The pain doesn't disappear, but it transforms. It becomes raw material, energy, clarity, and what once felt like punishment begins to reveal meaning. Not a meaning that's given, easy, or comfortable, but a meaning that's earned. Earned in the daily struggle of someone who refuses to abandon themselves, even when everything seems to push them in that direction. Maybe that's what makes Sisyphus so human, and so real. The image of someone who, even in the face of the absurd, chooses to keep climbing. Because there's a quiet dignity in those who persist. An invisible strength in those who choose not to give up on their own life. Even when everything loses its shine. Even when the world seems deaf and indifferent. Still, there is life. And that simple fact, so often overlooked, is everything. The heart still beats. The air still flows in. The eyes still see. That doesn't fix the emptiness. It doesn't erase the pain, but it creates space. Space for something new to happen. For a new voice to rise out of the silence. Jung said that life is not static. It is a continuous process of transformation. Even when no meaning is visible, the simple act of staying alive is already an act of resistance and trust in the soul's unfolding. Because meaning is not fixed, not final. It reveals itself slowly as we become more whole. With each small integration, with every step taken in awareness, even if it trembles, with every choice not to abandon oneself, even when everything feels lost. It's easy to live when everything makes sense. The challenge is to live when nothing seems to have a reason, and still not give in to apathy. Still, to choose to look within, to breathe, to wait, to listen. Because sometimes what feels like an end is simply the beginning of a new stage of psychic growth. A stage with no easy promises, but full of presence. And where there is presence, there is transformation. Even when life loses its meaning, there is still life. And as long as there is life, there is also the possibility of reconnecting with yourself, of uncovering new layers within, of recovering what once felt lost. There is no final answer, but there is a path, and that in itself is deeply human and deeply sacred.